Greetings, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm waiting for a response.
Yes, Henriette, it's Eleonora from the Secretariat. We can hear you well.
Fantastic, Eleonora. Well, good day, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Henriette Esterhuizen, and I'm currently the chair of the IGF Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group. And it's a huge pleasure for me to invite you to the opening of the IGF 2021, the hybrid IGF's preparatory and engagement phase. Today is a very significant day because this is really for us the first formal event where we're inviting you as the IGF community to participate in discussion of the IGF 2021 issue areas. I just want to say a few words about the preparatory and engagement phase. Why are we having this phase? It's really intended to serve four primary goals. The first is to facilitate in-depth engagement with the IGF 2021 issue areas. And part of that is to have a more outcome-oriented, a more issue-focused and impactful IGF. Secondly, it's really for us an opportunity to provide the IGF community with opportunities for developing capacity in IGF-linked areas. And that's why some of the sessions during this phase are capacity building oriented. And next, it's a way for us to engage with the IGF intersessional activities, to bring the work of the MAG in building the program, together with the work of the best practice forums, the national, regional, and youth IGF initiatives, and the dynamic coalitions and policy networks. But then finally, and I think most importantly, it's a way for us to broaden participation and inclusion in the IGF. We know that many of you won't be able to travel to Poland for the annual forum. We know that there are constraints with time zones and with language. And this phase is intended to create that extra modality of participation, of inclusion, of giving you the chance to hear what is being thought about by the MAG when they first identified these issues in response to input from the community, and then to give you the opportunity to participate in the process of creating outcomes, to synthesize and convey the dynamic and diverse dialogue and discussion that takes place at the IGF in a way that can then be accessed and used by other policy-making institutions. I won't say much more about the issue areas. You'll learn more about the two main issue areas later today. Our keynote speaker, Dr. David Suter, will talk a little bit about them. But the principle here is that the IGF is trying to discuss fewer issues in greater depth. That's why we have two main issues for 2021, universal access and meaningful connectivity, and economic and social inclusion and human rights. There are also four cross-cutting issues which we feel are emerging but might also continue and become more prominent in coming years. And those are environment and climate change, inclusive internet governance and digital cooperation, trust and security and stability, and emerging regulation. And in the course of this week, you'll learn more about all of these issues and have the opportunity to participate. On this, I'd like to actually hand over to my colleagues in the IGF Secretariat to tell us a little bit more about how we are planning to capture outcomes, how we planning to take this open bottom-up process that's so distinctive about the IGF, but channel that into formats that can then be used in other policy-making areas and by yourselves in your own work. Wim, can I hand over to you at this point?
Hello and good morning, good day all. Just switching on my my camera. Yes, one of the challenging things the IGF is since the last couple of years dealing with is how to now get all that information, how those exchanges that happen not only at the IGF meeting itself, but also during the ever more important preparatory phase and international work to get that into a format that is acceptable and is, I would say, digestible by the at the end of the whole process, after the meeting or at the IGF meeting. Those that have been involved in IGF before know that already 2 or 3 or 4 years, the IGF is trying to come up with clear messages coming out of the meeting. Is really saying on key topics, key discussion points, capture them and following them and listing them per issue area. So this year we're going to do the same, but we try to structure that a little bit more, and also include this whole preparatory phase. Start with the way how the issue areas were selected based on community input, and include also the discussions now today and in the coming days on the preparatory phase. So what is the idea? You will hear today, later today, and in the coming days, a presentation organized, or have a session organized by the different MAG issue teams that are responsible for the issue area. They will explain what the issue is about, what they plan to do roughly at the IGF meeting. But more important is that these sessions are also an opportunity to see what has happened between now and when the issues were selected. Like that was probably December, January, and things might have changed. New things can come up. So these issue areas or these sessions are an opportunity to flag that what is new. The next step is now that the MAG issue teams will make briefings or provide a briefing on the on what has been discussed, and use the information that comes in also for their main session later on at the IGF itself. There will also be a session, recap sessions of these phases of these sessions at the IGF itself. So that is how what is discussed now is linked with the IGF meeting itself and the further discussions. Later on, what has happened, what is happening at IGF 2021 will then, via a documentation process, further translated into concrete messages and more focused outcome. But I think the most important now is the issues will be presented, and it is an opportunity for you to provide input, say if something is missing, say if something should be added, and that will then will feed into the process and the also in the reporting. I'd like to keep it there, very short, but I hope that's helpful. And then hand over back to Henriette.
Thank you very much, Wim, and thanks to the Secretariat for putting so much effort into this. And I encourage everyone in the call, in the meeting, to ask questions in the chat. The Secretariat is on standby to answer any questions you have about how you can give input and what will happen with the outputs. Now I want to give the floor to Shengatai Masango, the head of the IGF Secretariat, who'll tell us a little bit more about the hybrid IGF, and he'll be followed by Wyman Kwok from UNDESA. I'm just checking that Wyman is with us. He's with us. He's joining us from New York, where he got up very early to just give us this perspective of UNDESA, the United Nations Division for Economic and Social Affairs, which is where the IGF is located, on why the IGF is so significant, and why we are adopting this approach to preparation and engagement. But Shengatai, first to you to tell us more about the hybrid IGF 2021.
Hi, Henriette. It's Eleanor from the Secretariat. I'm sorry, I don't think Shengatai has joined us yet. He might be having some difficulties. So I suggest maybe moving on to Wyman.
That would be ideal. Thanks, Eleonora. Wyman, please introduce yourself and share your views on how we can make IGF 2021 impactful and strategic.
Thank you. Thanks, Andre, and thanks for having me. My name is Wyman Kwok. I'm the Senior Governance and Public Administration Officer at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA. On behalf of UNDESA, I welcome the active involvement and participation of MEC members and stakeholders across the different groups here. First, I would like to applaud the MEC, in particular the MEC Chair Andreas, for taking the step forward to not only suggest, conceptualize, and putting great efforts really to organize this series of preparatory and engagement phase. I also like to highlight that the 5 issues areas for IGF 2021 are actually indeed very important and also very much connected to the global agenda from economic and social inclusion and human rights, universal access and meaningful connectivity, emerging regulation, environmental sustainability and climate change, inclusive internet governance ecosystem and digital cooperation, and lastly on trust security. These issues under discussion, they are indeed very deeply linked to the SDGs, and many of which have a cross-cutting effect and with dynamic roles in affecting the SDGs, not just at the goals level, but also at the several SDG targets and indicators level. And I think many of you know, as you also heard here at the recently held general debates at the General Assembly and earlier HLPF, the High-Level Political Forum in New York, that countries and the global community in general suffered a setback, and also many of the achievement of the SDG has been regressed because of COVID-19, and it's continued to impact many countries. So we do hope that the discussion here can actually give a good momentum push to the achievement of the SDG, accelerated achievement for that matter. Lastly, I'd like to mention that of the connection that some of you also know that the IGF is one of the few platforms or UN forums mentioned specifically in the Secretary General report on our common agenda. He called for the IGF to adapt, innovate, and reform. And I see that this one step in this preparatory phase is in a way that IGF is adapting to the common agenda. From the UN Secretariat, we hope that the IGF outcomes can contribute to the different processes across the UN system. We know that many UN agencies, they are actually working in process related to digitalization, and they are also playing different roles in the IGF. I must take comfort to say that there are more UN agencies involved in this year IGF, last year IGF, as compared to what the IGF was 10 years ago. We also hope that the current processes will continue to be a guiding compass for future IGF. As you know, after Poland this year, the IGF will also move to other regions beyond Europe, specifically in Ethiopia in 2022 next year, and Japan in 2023. Since we have so many participants here, I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to invite any government or stakeholders to express interest for the opening of the host country in 2024. With that, I'd like to pass back the floor to Andreas.
Thank you very much, Wyman, and for connecting all those dots between the IGF, its uniqueness, the UN system, the global agenda, and the recent released report from the Secretary General called Our Common Agenda. Now to give us an opportunity to look really at the bigger picture, because I think that is what is so unique about what we do in the IGF, is that we look at specific internet governance challenges, but through the lens of broader impacts on society. I'm very happy to give the floor for a few keynote remarks to Dr. David Suter, who is someone who's very familiar with the IGF and who has been, I think, at every single IGF. David is an independent researcher. He writes on the digital society and the impact of new technology on the environment and development and governance. And he's also attached to the UK IGF, the United Kingdom National Internet Governance Forum. And he's taught communications policy at the University of Strathclyde and the London School of Economics. And he's also worked with other agencies and institutions in the UN system. So David, over to you for your reflections on IGF 2021, issue areas, and current internet governance challenges.
Well, thank you, Henriette. Would it be possible to share my screen? Whoever is managing that.
Yes, Secretariat, Louise, if you can please allow David to show his slides. You should be able to, David, have you tried?
I'm told I'm disabled at the moment from it.
Please kindly retry. This is Luis.
It
Okay.
should work now, David, so please go ahead.
Okay, so Henriette asked me yesterday to talk about some of the large-scale challenges I think face internet governance in the next few years, and to be a bit big picture and a bit provocative, I think, to start the session. I'll try to do that. At the IGF, it seems to me we often concentrate on specific themes, which might be technical or more generic, like access and cybersecurity. The 8 challenges I'm going to raise today are more fundamental issues, which I think affect the internet as a whole, and its place in the wider framework of digital governance and the governance of societies in general. And I'll come to them shortly, but I want to start with a more fundamental question still that I think we need to ask more than we do, which is what actually is the internet? And here are 2 ways of looking at that. Is it a technological phenomenon? Is it a set of rules and protocols, software and hardware, or is it a social, economic, and cultural phenomenon, something that's defined by its services, the businesses that run them, the people that make use of them? And I ask this because our answer profoundly affects the ways in which we think about its governance. Most books and lectures on this still start with the technology, with the protocols and the domain name systems and the layer model that's often used to illustrate. And obviously that's very important. But what matters to most people and most stakeholders in practice, and so what defines the internet for them, is the impact that it has on them, on their societies, economies, and cultures, on equality and rights, on politics and the environment, the way we live, what we care about. If we think about the internet primarily as a technological phenomenon, we're tempted to look for technological solutions. Solutions is what they're often called, and consider the needs of technology first before thinking through the interests of society. But if we think of it as a societal phenomenon, we're more likely to prioritize its impact on human relationships and on mainstream governance. And I think we need to start from both. I'd say this is not a new phenomenon. 20 years ago, some of us talked of narrow and broad internet governance, and those terms have become unfashionable today, but they encapsulate an important dichotomy between governance that concerns the internet itself on the narrow side, and governance that concerns the impact of the internet, the broader view, on which I mostly write. I'd say this stretches back to the World Summit that gave birth to the IGF. So here's the working definition of internet governance that was agreed there. And that's primarily concerned with technicalities, with the development and application of the internet, rules, norms, decision-making procedures. The reference to use in it is essentially contingent on these. I'd contrast this with the opening lines of the summit's Geneva Declaration, which sought a people-centered, inclusive, and development-oriented information society, which is much more concerned with the outcomes of the internet than how it works, with empowerment, sustainable development, human rights, and so on. It's about shaping the information society and governing the internet with those objectives in mind. So what are the implications of thinking about the internet from this societal perspective rather than a technological perspective? My view of internet governance today and of the challenges it faces really rests on the changing nature of the internet. Public policy goals have become much more important as the internet's evolved, including in the life cycle of the IGF. So from being on the margins, the internet now has massive social impacts, many of them unexpected. Those impacts are occurring too fast for established governments' mechanisms outside the internet to adjust to them. And I think many of the challenges to internet governance itself today derive from this and from the ways in which online services have evolved, where I'd stress 3 things in particular. So first, the growing significance of the internet, which makes the interface between technological and social impacts increasingly important. Far more people online, far more is done online. The digital environment is much more influential. The opportunities and risks are greater. And then second, the commercialization of the internet and the emergence of dominant companies with a high degree of market power, which means that many decisions concerning the internet's development and impact are now made by them. And third, the proliferation of international decision-making spaces that's made participation in governance more difficult, particularly for smaller countries and stakeholders with limited resources. In summary, I'd say that governance arrangements need to evolve along with what they govern if they're to be effective. This is a problem I think the American Constitution now has as well. Governance arrangements that are needed for the world's most important communications platform, which is what the internet now is, are obviously different from those that suited the internet that was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And they need to be oriented more towards its outcomes than its origins. I think that's a practical necessity as well as an appropriate way forward. I see this emphasis, I think, in the focus areas for this year's IGF. All of these are primarily concerned, it seems to me, with the societal impact of the internet and the interface between that and technology. So they include areas that require policy intervention by governments, like universal access and emerging regulation, by business, like environmental sustainability and cybersecurity, and by civil society, such as inclusion and human rights. And of course, all of those require attention by all of those stakeholders. And they require cross-cutting engagement in which public policy responds to the opportunities and risks of new technology, and technologists respond to the needs of public policy. They're relevant at both national and international levels. And they're going to change over time as circumstances change, new services, new ways of doing things, new impacts which are desired or undesired, new externalities. So to my 8 challenges for internet and digital governance, which is a broader context. And each of these 8 challenges, it seems to me, requires rethinking of the parameters that we've put around internet governance so far. I've mentioned a couple of them already. But first, the internet today is simply bigger and more diverse than previously. The range of services is greater, it's continually growing. It's been transformed by growth in the capacity of networks and devices, mobility, the Internet of Things, cloud computing. All this is continuing and accelerating. And 2 points arise from it. Governance mechanisms aren't always scalable. Ways of governing the internet that worked when it was smaller and less complex won't be sufficient now it's larger and more complex. I'm often surprised by the resistance there is to changing governance modalities as a result of this. After all, the internet began by radically disrupting the governance and business models of communications. It's required other sectors to transform their models wholesale. And the same logic of disruption applies to the internet's own governance arrangements. Secondly, I'd say, and associated with this, the internet is the changing nature of the digital environment in general. The internet's no longer at the cutting edge of this. The most important technological advances, which are the most important issues for digital governance now, aren't to do with the internet as a communications medium. They're to do with other digital developments, data management, machine learning and artificial intelligence, algorithmic decision-making, robotics and autonomous vehicles, virtual reality, quantum computing. Internet governance does not provide adequate models for governing those new digital phenomena, which is why there's rightly so much of a discussion now, for instance, about the ethics of AI. My third issue concerns the concentration of power online. So technologists and many people here have always emphasized the decentralizing force that is inherent in the internet's technology and protocols, power on the internet lying with end users, there being no center to the internet. But that's a technological logic, and economic logic differs from it. Networks give powerful advantages to big players that can maximize numbers of users, achieve economies of scope and scale, and leverage data to maximize value to consumers and themselves. And the result has been the concentration of online power in a few large companies with global reach that can act effectively unchecked by the majority of governments, not something envisaged at the time of the World Summit, for example. They've become the most powerful actors in internet governance today, and their decisions are decidedly not subject to the principles of multi-stakeholderism. But at the same time, there have been shifts in global geopolitics. I'd cite three here. So first, those dominant online businesses are almost all located in two countries. So maybe 20 years ago, the fear of many countries was that the internet was dominated by America. Now China's as important, and it leads in some new digital technologies. Between them, China and the United States have 90% of market capitalization of the 70 largest digital platforms. Africa and Latin America between them have 1%. And we should be thinking of what that shift in digital geopolitics implies, not just for governing technology itself, but in areas like human rights, like development, like the environment, and about its implications for the universality of internet governance. How realistic is it that that can be sustained in the way that it has been so far? Second, the 30 years in which the internet's evolved have seen the world become much more divided than it was. And to a considerable degree, they've seen authoritarian nationalism supersede liberal internationalism. Achieving digital cooperation, which is a key aim for the Secretary General, is becoming harder. And that really matters in areas like cybersecurity, just as it does in areas like climate change. Governments are also much more capable of interfering with each other's internet environments and more inclined to do that. And then thirdly, the biggest challenge of all facing international governance is climate change. Like everything else, internet governance is going to evolve in a context that's redefined by climate change and by the success or failure of steps to mitigate it, such as those going on in my country this week, and by the conflicts that will follow likely failures. So I mentioned earlier the opening sentence of the World Summit 18 years ago, which called for a people-centered, inclusive and development-oriented information society, which means shaping the digital future in ways that work with other goals we have, rather than letting technology shape the future for us. So in work I've done for the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development, I've characterized that goal in these three terms: preserving what we value, promoting what we want, and preventing what we fear. And there'll be disagreements about what those mean, but achieving them, irrespective of what they mean, achieving them requires governance that's consistent with other goals the international community's agreed, including the international human rights regime, the Sustainable Development Agenda, and the need to reverse climate change. Point 6 follows from this. The internet community and businesses have been keen to avoid regulation and sought what they've called permissionless innovation as distinct from the precautionary principle that's generally applied in other economic sectors. So the principle that we should assess potential hazards before giving free rein to new inventions, which is the norm in industries like chemicals and pharmaceuticals, and in other new technologies, frontier technologies such as genetics. It's at the root of environmental audits. It's been fundamental to achieving public trust in COVID vaccines. There's growing anxiety amongst the public and amongst governments about the risks associated with what Mark Zuckerberg had in mind when he called for Facebook to move fast and break things. And part of that's due to experience. For example, the way that corporations have exploited the lack of rules governing data privacy, and parts due to concern about potential impacts of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making, which can have profound and irreversible effects on society before mainstream governance can take account of them. So those concerns, I think, are going to require rethinking of the relationship between permissionless innovation and the precautionary principle. Perhaps this week, I'd say that few people outside Facebook think the metaverse should be unregulated. So my seventh point would be to do with multi-stakeholderism, which has been an important part of the way the internet's been governed from its early days. But I think the model of it that emerged from the World Summit is looking tired and worn. First, the standard stakeholder groupings are not sufficiently disaggregated. There are huge differences between government departments that manage communications and those that use them to provide public services, between businesses that supply the internet and businesses that use the internet, between different groups of users who have different interests, different resources, different capabilities, not to mention those who aren't yet on the internet, but whose lives are affected profoundly by it. representation in internet decision-making is skewed towards insiders, to the supply side of the internet rather than the demand side. And second, I think the stakeholders themselves have changed. As of their resources, global corporations can throw huge sums at influencing outcomes. Many decisions are made in their boardrooms or through negotiations between them and governments. And the internet itself has changed. Many issues require both multilateral and multi-stakeholder engagement. The UN Secretary General stressed that governance should be multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary as well, should bring economists and social scientists to the table, for example, along with technologists and communications specialists. And my last point would be related to this, and is the challenge of equitable and inclusive international governance. 20 years ago, I wrote a report on developing country participation in international communications. Countries in the North could put money, personnel, and resources into attending meetings, planning initiatives, making deals, influencing outcomes, but most in the South could not. And as a result, decisions reflected the interests of wealthy countries from the North, not those of developing countries in the South. Technical standards, too, were affected by this because they were set by what was possible in high-income countries rather than what was possible in those with limited resources. Well, that's not changed, and the proliferation of decision-making fora has made it worse. So can internet governance become more inclusive of those who currently lack power, and if so, how? Which is where I'll end. And I was going to go back to the slide about shaping the digital future, which it seems to me to be the most fundamental point that I've tried to make, because it addresses the key goal of the World Summit that gave birth to the IGF, how to achieve a people-centered, inclusive and development-oriented information society, which is no easy task. And it's one that requires broad-based and inclusive dialogue, which is something for which the IGF is especially appropriate. I think both globally and nationally, my own national IGF in Britain demonstrated this very well, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So I hope this year's hybrid global event can take forward this agenda, and that I've been at least a little provocative and said some things that will be interesting or helpful within the discussion that's to come. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, David, and for sharing those reflections. And I think we'll come back to them, or aspects of those reflections, in the course of this IGF, but also as we pave the way towards a relevant, effective IGF that plays that role in digital cooperation that you were outlining. So thanks very much for being with us. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Sylvia Cadena from the Asia Pacific Network Information Center Foundation. She's with us from Brisbane, and she will moderate the first of these issue areas that IGF 2021 is focusing on: universal access and meaningful connectivity. And I think that when you look at the background document that the MAG developed, David, I hope that you feel that the MAG is taking a holistic approach and a people-centered approach to how they're looking at internet governance in 2021. So Sylvia, over to you, but I cannot give you the floor before I want to thank the MAG members, the issue team for universal access and meaningful connectivity, the MAG members and all their helpers, the volunteers who've contributed to shaping this issue area, developing today's session, but also the main session that will take place in December when we have the annual forum. So thanks very much. Congratulations to the MAG members. And Sylvia Cadena, a past MAG member as well, over to you.
Thank you very much, Henriette. Really appreciate your warm welcome. Eleonora, would you mind to share the initial slides, please? Thank you very much, Eleonora. Welcome to the preparatory session for the Universal Access and Meaningful Connectivity Issue Area session. The purpose of this preliminary phase of the IGF, as Henriette mentioned in the opening segment, is to engage people in IGF discussions and identify synergies between different activities to facilitate cooperation. This pre-program is organized jointly by the MAG, working in issue teams dedicated to the program's different areas, intersectional activities, including the NRIs who chose to participate, the Secretariat, as well as community members. Through the preparatory process, the MAG identified universal access and meaningful connectivity as one of the issues for the 2021 IGF agenda. I would like to thank the members of the MAG working group that were working in this issue area team for all their efforts to organize the session and for giving me the opportunity to moderate it, in particular to Susan, Roberto, Carlos, and Karim. Ensuring that all people everywhere have meaningful and sustainable access to the internet is a priority, as the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly demonstrated. The concept of universal access has evolved over time, and evidence increasingly indicates that access to connectivity is not sufficient on its own. During the course of this session and during the agenda of sessions at the IGF in the coming weeks, session organizers will explore the linkages between access, adoption, and ability to use, content and applications, and equity. During the next 90 minutes, we will be covering three main topics in the agenda. First, Sonia Jorge will provide some introductory remarks about the definition of universal access and meaningful connectivity. Then we'll have a great lineup of speakers covering a variety of issues related to two main topics, the universal access to infrastructure and then accessibility. So please allow me to introduce Sonia Jorge, Executive Director of the Alliance for Affordable Internet from the Web Foundation. Sonia is an expert in the confluence of development and communications policy with over 25 years of experience, as you can see in the bio that is in the slides that Eleonora is sharing, and lots of experience of a career spanning the service to private and non-profit sectors, as well as policy advisors in numerous digital policy and development projects in over 40 countries across a wide range of stakeholders. Sonia will be focusing on the definition of universal access and meaningful connectivity, as well as the barriers to it. So over to you, Sonia. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I was wondering if someone either lets me share my screen or if Eleonora is going to share my slides. Eleonora, can you share? Because I think you have it, if you don't mind switching.
Okay, just give me one moment, Sonia, or else you could also share them, but just give me a moment.
I was, let me see. Let me see if it lets me now.
If you stop sharing your screen, Eleonora, then Sonia can.
Yes. There we go.
Let me see if it works.
Yes.
There you go.
We see them.
Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Do you see it on presenter mode or in regular presentation mode?
In regular mode. If you can put it in the presentation mode, that would be great.
It is on presentation mode on mine. That's
no, it is not. It's in presentation mode.
It is in presentation mode now for all
no,
of you?
it's in the slide. You see the slides on the left. You have to click on the bottom to.
No, I know, but it's on my.
Yeah, that's the problem when you were sharing.
Yeah, okay. I know. So let me see if I can try again. I'm just going to that again. Tell me if you can see now in presentation mode.
Same thing.
I think it's okay, Sonia. Okay. We can still see the slides. Please continue.
You can.
Yeah.
All right. I apologize because I can't. In my view, is present. So anyway, apologies for that. Clearly, technology, still has some challenges when we're trying to do these in a hybrid or virtual mode. But thank you first and foremost to the organizers and to the MAG for inviting us. And I wanted to say that my presentation today is not just a reflection of the work that we at the Alliance for Affordable Internet are doing, but really very much informed by all of your inputs through the consultations that we did, and most recently also through the discussions that the Policy Network on Meaningful Access has done, that I am very honored to co-chair with the amazing Sylvia Cadena, who's now moderating this session. So thank you, Sylvia, also for your incredible support here in this process. And we thought that to do this today, we needed to start a little bit on definitions. And I'm going to present to you our thinking, but it's thinking again that has been informed by all. And most importantly, is thinking that we think that is important to start with here. Given, for example, what David was just mentioning in his keynote, all of the different, elements, dimensions of the entire ecosystem, right? That it is digital development. We wanted to really focus on understanding, what do we mean by meaningful connectivity? What do we mean by meaningful access? What is universal access versus all of these? So let's try to give clarity, so that as we continue the discussions, not just today, but in Poland, we all know what we're talking about. We all know what we are referring to, okay? So first, why did we think about defining the concept of meaningful access and meaningful connectivity? Partially, as you all can know, A4AI, we had quite a bit of success in what we call the 142 model, which was the target that we established and defined for affordability, and that was adopted by the Broadband Commission. And it was really important for us when we did that by having something that was very clear, but also that it was clearly also measured, that it really took on a life of its own beyond our advocacy. And so we were motivated by the success of that experience in really challenging ourselves and our partners around the world to think about a new way of thinking about access to the internet. And after a lot of discussions, of course, those terms started kind of consolidating. But let me explain to you a bit why for us it was also important to do that exercise. Why did we need a definition? And why do we all need to understand and agree on the definition? First, the current definitions, as you all know, of access to the internet are quite underwhelming, right? They also insufficient. And they very, very much based on these binary understanding and on or offline. But also the way access to the internet currently is being measured and analyzed is really based on what we like to call at FYI an illusion of coverage. This idea that there is coverage through networks, and that everyone that is covered, even if they have access to the internet just one time within the last 3 months, that's it. The situation is solved. Well, clearly, I know that all of you here on this session don't agree with that. And no, precisely because of the work that we've been doing for many years, trying to really center internet access in a human rights framework, in a framework that it's about not just technology, but technology for development, technology for social and economic opportunity. So that understanding of that definition of internet access then requires much greater clarity. Yes?
Sonia, sorry, just wondering if you're still on the first slide?
No, I've already changed it. Don't tell me that it's not moving.
No, it's not moving. So would you mind to share your screen again?
Well, it says that I'm sharing. I will stop sharing then. Let me see. And start again, or otherwise, maybe
sorry,
I can
may I come in? Yes, sorry, it's Eleonora. I will share my screen and display, and you can just tell me, Sonia, when to move on to the next slide.
Sure. I apologize for that. So Sylvia, I was moving the slides. So
I was moving my hands trying to tell you.
I am now on slide. Sorry. Okay. I apologize for that. All right. So Eleonora, let's see what you're sharing. We don't see the screen yet. Okay. So I went through the first three, and I am now on, I don't know if you saw, I'm now on slide 4. Okay. So apologies for that technical issue. So a couple of things are important when we define terminology, right? And here, of course, we're talking about this idea of internet access beyond the technical and really focusing on the key question in the initial slide that I guess you were still stuck with: what is meaningful access? And so for us to define this term, we need to understand a couple of things that are foundational to understanding how do we define access. One is that access, of course, needs to be relevant. It needs to be measurable. It needs to be evidence-based. It needs to be gender responsive. And importantly, we need to think about open internet access, right? Access to the entire open internet. So no artificial restrictions, etc. I think you all understand these points. So next slide, please. Taking into account these definitional foundations, as well as this desire to improve the concept of internet access beyond the technological and going into what we are using and calling meaningful access, we had several consultations with many of you. And next slide, please. And came to an understanding very clearly amongst all of us that there are a couple of ideas that we need to consider. One is that there's this concept of meaningful access, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more detail about how we see that. But we see meaningful access as important because it facilitates meaningful use. And I think actually the work of many folks here on this call, including APC and many of its partners, has been quite instrumental in understanding the concept of not just meaningful use, but strategic use, right? Really turning the concept of meaningful access into something that is meaningful to people's lives. And so I want you to start with this construct of meaningful access as facilitating meaningful use, because for us, what we understand is that when someone has meaningful access, then we see ideal use cases for meaningful use unpacking and being uncovered. Next slide. And so think about that first circle of meaningful access, which is really the focus of what I'm trying to get you to think about here. And what does that include? And there's a couple of things here that are very important, especially for us as we've developed this concept of meaningful connectivity at A4AI. I want to start by explaining that the concept of meaningful connectivity is one of 3 key elements that we see make up meaningful access. Meaningful connectivity is really the technical foundation that allows meaningful access. And I'll explain to you why it's technical in scope in a minute. But meaningful access goes beyond just meaningful connectivity. And this is important here for us to differentiate when we speak about these issues, right? Meaningful access assumes that we have affordable access, that we have, meaning we can pay for the kind of data that we want for the opportunities that we demand, that we have meaningful connectivity, and again, I'll tell you this precise elements of that technical foundation, but also that we have a social environment that is conducive to supporting meaningful access. And this is really important for us in this discussion on universal access overall and meaningful connectivity and meaningful access, as you see from these, from my sharing with you these ideas, that they are related, but they are different. So if you look at this slide and think about the elements that make up meaningful access, I hope that it makes sense to you that those elements have to work together. Now, what has happened for years is, as David also pointed out, a lot of the work that has taken place, including the work on policy and regulatory frameworks, has really focused a lot on the technical elements of meaningful connectivity, but also on affordable access. Very little attention, very few resources have in fact been spent and used to not only support the social environment elements, but to nurture them, to sustain them, and to expand them. And those social environment elements, first and foremost, are grounded on human rights and provide things like digital literacy, the needed content, different languages, and the diversity of languages that is necessary to make access meaningful to many different people, the capacity for people to be able to engage with technology and more. So all of those that we encapsulate that into the social environment are really what some call also the complements, the qualitative elements of meaningful access that are just as instrumental as meaningful connectivity, the technical foundation, as well as affordable access, to secure that whole entire picture of meaningful access so that we can get to meaningful use. Next slide, please. Just to clarify, what do I mean by meaningful connectivity? Based on the work that we've done, we came to this definition that, again, it's technical in scope, that includes 4 dimensions. Sufficient speed, and you can see what that means. Those are minimum thresholds. So sufficient speed, a minimum threshold being a 4G equivalent connection. A smart device, at a minimum, a smartphone device. Sufficient data with an unlimited connections at home or the place of work or study. And sufficient relevance, right? In this way, measured by daily internet use. Now, we came up with this very much technical foundation because, and again, remember I guess you probably didn't see the slide now, but the definitional foundations is that everything needed to be measured. Everything needed to be measured based also on gender and more. So all of these dimensions that you see here, which are the technical foundation of meaningful access, what we call meaningful connectivity, these are measurable. In fact, we have started measuring these, and we are publishing the first global report on meaningful connectivity early next year. Now, with that, I hope I've made it clear to you that first, we need to understand the differences between meaningful connectivity and meaningful access. But most importantly, we have an opportunity with our work here today and at the IGF and next year to not only clarify, but to make sure that meaningful access, the whole entire picture of meaningful access, is also paid attention to. Next slide, Eleonora, so I can finish up. So a few considerations and asks for you here. We now measure affordability and have this framework for meaningful connectivity. But let me tell you, there is absolutely no agreed standard or measuring framework for all the other elements of meaningful access. There is no definition for digital skills. What are digital skills? What are basic digital skills? What are advanced digital skills? There's no definition, no way to measure content, the quality of content, the ability to use information and have access to information in multiple languages, the ability to exercise rights online. All of these are still up in the air. So how would we measure? And I think we have an incredible opportunity here through these, not just the policy network at IGF, but the IGF as a whole, and this theme to actually shed light and clarify how is it that we want the world to measure meaningful access in this more holistic way that we want to understand it. And so I take the opportunity to call attention to all of you that the policy network has and is putting out a call for inputs, cases, stories from all of you and the entire IGF community that we hope will illustrate some of these elements and help us start attempting to turning those cases and stories and inputs into a proposed measuring framework for all of those elements of the social environment in meaningful access. And finally, I want to say that many of the upcoming sessions under this theme at the IGF in December will actually address these questions precisely. So I challenge all of you, and I invite you all to participate in those sessions and to bring clarity to some of these questions that we all want to get down to, so we can then have a clear understanding of meaningful access in a way that is not only more holistic, but that it includes the technical elements, the affordability elements, as well as the social environment elements that are so important for the goals of digital development. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for your call for action. That is exactly what the IGF is about. I now would like to ask Eleonora to share the slides about the bios of the speakers. In the next block, we have 15 minutes to welcome two speakers, Carlos Baca and Adriana Labardini. I would like to welcome Carlos Baca first. He is the Training and Mentoring Coordinator of the Local Networks Initiative LOCNet and General Coordinator of Centro de Investigación de Tecnologías y Saberes Comunitarios, CITSAC, which will bring us the views of community networks and capacity building. This session will be wrapped by Adriana Labardini, public interest ICT lawyer at Law Technology and Development, who will focus her intervention around spectrum access and its impact to achieve universal connectivity. Welcome, Carlos. Community networks are an emerging and very important player in the rainbow of possible organizational approaches to affordable and sustainable universal access to infrastructure. As community-driven initiatives, they also approach capacity building in a very different way. Can you please share with us how the approach to capacity building that community networks have developed enhanced universal access to infrastructure? You have 7 minutes, and please keep the chat open, so when I wave at you, you see me trying to keep the time right. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Silvia. Thanks, Sonia, for this wonderful beginning of this session. I want to share some ideas with you. I can't share. Can you allow me to share my screen, please?
Hi, Carlos, it's the secretary. You should be allowed to. Are you having difficulties?
Yes, I can't share the screen. It says that host.
Please try again.
Screen. Okay. Now it's working. Okay, so I want to share with you some ideas about capacity building and training, and how the community networks are doing some kind of job to understand more what kind of capacity building is needed to reach this meaningful access to internet. So the first idea is that, as you know, there is a lot of public policies that doesn't work for the needs of the people. Here is a rooftop of the municipality in one Oaxacan indigenous community. 9 different kinds of antennas, and only 2 works right now. And it's, for me, proof that the governments are doing the same thing every period of the time. Here, Mexico is 6 years, and all the public policies maintain in the same way to only make connectivity, and to the government wants to get all the job to connect the people in the communities, and it doesn't work. Why it doesn't work? Mainly because this is a model in which the maintenance of the networks can be reached in a good way, because they need the people from the cities go to the communities and give the maintenance and manage all the networks. So the networks fight, and big white elephant. I don't know if English is the same, but here in Mexico, we can say that it is un elefante blanco that doesn't work. But community networks is an alternative, a very good alternative, because the people in the communities learn how to maintain the network, how to install a new equipment, how to manage the networks, and there is an important thing that it is linked to the structures and the way of life of the community. The networks make more sustainable over the time, and it helps to reach connectivity goals and also access in another way that we can understand in a big panorama. So I only want to share that these ideas is from two different experience in which I collaborated. One is Tequio Comunitario, that it is a training program for technical promoters in communities in Mexico and Latin America. And right now we are collaborating with ITU to develop this training program. And because this experience was very successful, right now in the LogNet initiative, in Local Networks Initiative from APC and Rhizomatica, trying to use this methodology that is based in the participatory action research to develop training programs also in 5 different countries, in Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Indonesia, and Brazil. So this is, if you want more information, I can share some links here in the chat for you to know more about it. Why capacity building is important to universal and meaningful access? First one, because people learn how to install, operate, maintain, and manage the networks, and this improve the quality of telecommunication services, and also the maintaining and operating costs are reduced, so we can offer affordable. The other one is the critical thinking of technologies allow within other ways of connecting and interacting with them. So it helps in 2 different ways. In one way, communities can choose the technologies that are most appropriate in their context. And the other one is that the risks associated with access to ICTs are understood, are mitigated. So these 2 things are very important. The next one is because networks are from and through the political and organizational structures of the community. And this is very important because the management of the networks is insert in the way of the communities to make the political life. So here in Mexico, for example, the people who works in the networks go with the charge system in the political. You can be a policeman and you can be a manager of the network, and this is the same level of responsibility in the community. The next one is because the local economy are not deteriorated by incorporation of technologies. It is very important because in our experience in a lot of communities, when the telecommunication services insert in the community life, it only has more problems than solutions of the problems. So in the community networks, the economic resources remain in the community. The income support the livelihoods of the people who work in the networks, and through local content, they also promote and disseminate the local products or local services, and it helps to make a better relation the regional commerce, for example. And the last one is because knowledge and information are socialized, and it resonates to another experiences to create more community media, to create more community networks, and helps other community to develop their own communication projects. Let me check the chat if there is something here. No. Okay.
I did send you a warning, Carlos, so you're running out of time.
Okay, let me go fast. Kind of training program do we need? We need a training program that responds to the specific dreams and needs that exist in the communities. One whose methodology is based on the ways of learning and exchanging knowledge in the communities. One that is based on the experience linked to the technologies that all people have. One whose main purpose is for people to meet and generate mutual support networks for the development of the technological project. One that allows people to break paradigms and eliminate the fears that prevent the transformation and utilization of technology. And it's provocation to talk about it in the IGF, in Poland, or online if you can go. Is what kind of public policy do we need? And this is the kind of policy that generates the appropriate environment for these types of training to take place, not one that thinks that the government or companies will do everything, but one that facilitates, strengthens, and promotes the training and capacity building processes that the communities themselves are doing. And for that, we need to understand this key idea that the technology must be adapted to the lifestyle of the community and their development goals, not the other way around, not the communities need to adapt to the technology. So this is the main ideas I want to share with you. And if you want, I can share some links and other information in the
Thank
chat.
you. Thank you, Carlos. We shared the links on the chat, and Glenn also shared the book as an ebook as well. So I think you can scroll up and have a look at the rest of the chat. I think that although your presentation, your intervention was focused more on the capacity building side of things, one thing that always comes to mind when we talk about community networks is this alternative idea, this alternative organizational arrangement that could probably be even considered or defined as an alternative kind of business model that also brings other elements of the conversation to the floor, very similar to what we heard in the keynote of the opening segment. So with this, I thank you, Carlos, and I welcome Adriana. Adriana, I don't think Eleonora might be able to share your bio on the screen. We had that initial plan to alternate between slides, but probably that is not working that well. So that I don't have to read all your amazing experience. So independently of the organizational approach selected that, as we have heard earlier, is supposed to be fit for purpose and culturally appropriate, access to spectrum plays a vital role to achieve universal connectivity. I wondered if you could drive us a little bit around why and how a more democratic and affordable access to spectrum use may contribute to universal access and meaningful connectivity. And I would really appreciate if you can stick to your 7 minutes, please. Thank you. Welcome, Adriana.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you all for this most important and needed debate. Before diving into spectrum access issues, I just want to put in context that in order to close the digital divide and enable new connectivity models, such as bottom-up connectivity models, community networks, small local operators, cooperatives, we need to create, and states need to create, an enabling environment. That enabling environment consists of enabling policies for spectrum access, for licensing, for affordable access to backhaul, that is the transport of the data and voice traffic, rethinking universal service funding. They do not need to keep going into the large operators who first refused to serve rural areas. and also to create local content, and as Carlos just mentioned, to make a bet and put resources, public resources, into capacity building, both technical capacity building, managerial, and for local content, and to have much more in mind than we have in the past, all the international law of indigenous rights, the indigenous people's rights to self-determination and to their own media and communications. Having said that, then we can understand the first enabling ingredient, which is, as I said, affordable spectrum access. As we all know, spectrum is an essential input, a public resource that has been put in the hands of a very few operators. It is essential for mobile broadband, for satellite communications, but also for backhaul through microwaves, and also for broadcasting and other radio communication services. It is to the extent that this resource is made accessible for more players, new players at the local level to serve the underserved or the unserved communities, then the more we will be contributing to close the digital divide. Where national or global operators in the global markets are not doing it because it's not profitable to deploy infrastructure in remote, rural, or low-income areas. Although spectrum is a scarce resource in certain bands, in certain geographic locations, and in certain times of the day, it is also a largely subutilized resource in less populated localities and in many times around the clock, and thus it can be shared and it can be managed and should be managed differently by states and regulators. Decades of spectrum auctions assigning large chunks of spectrum to a handful of mobile operators for 20 or 30 years with a national-wide license has left spectrum largely subutilized and has left out millions of people in rural communities. It has also proven not as efficient, auctions, not as efficient as economists promised, as the billions paid in spectrum fees to government never went into universal service fundings, and also forced the operators, because that's the way markets work, to only deploy infrastructure in profitable areas, mainly large cities. Also, large operators have huge operating expenses. And so even if subsidized to put infrastructure in rural areas, they still are not sustainable because of large operating expenses. And so with the astonishing innovation in wireless technologies, cognitive radios, dynamic spectrum sharing technologies, and the possibility of using spectrum on a secondary basis, which is a widely known concept in ITU and in many jurisdictions, the new paradigm for state and regulators should be a policy of use it or share it. Don't license spectrum that will not be used for 20 years, leaving out so many people, basically half of the world population. We should not keep the status quo of an artificial scarcity caused by simply granting these long-term property rights over spectrum when it is a public resource, and especially when much of it remains unused or unshared. We have to understand that there are three tiers of the economy: global, national, and local, and each of them has different logics, different efficient players, and different dynamics. In local economies, local players are more efficient and they can be sustainable. Sustainable broadband connections in very scarce populated places like rural and peri-urban slums need efficient local players with low operating expenses that can prevail over time, so that we don't see every 5 years these dead projects of satellite connectivity subsidized by states that were then abandoned because were just unsustainable. Sharing of spectrum on a local basis is already being used in advanced economies as the United Kingdom, where the regulator Ofcom has allowed local small operators to use IMT bands, that is mobile broadband bands, to serve local areas for at least 5 years at very low costs, while the primary user, the large operator, is using it in other areas. And so Ofcom manages this and makes sure that there is no interference. The main justification for regulating spectrum should be to avoid interference. One of the biggest success stories of spectrum sharing has been Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is the ultimate case of spectrum sharing as a commons good, and with a great economic and social impact for all. In Mexico, my country, spectrum is also being licensed for indigenous community networks, setting up their own mobile network, first with a 2G network and hopefully soon a 4G network, connecting 63 indigenous villages otherwise neglected by state and market. These are non-profit operators, and so it is important to be allowing spectrum assignments with no fees or very, very affordable fees, because as a state, you don't want to cash spectrum. You want spectrum to be an enabler of inclusion, innovation, education, health services, and economic activity. Promoting local economies is good for the sustainable development goals. We also have examples of TV white spaces being shared, all those portions of spectrum not used by TV broadcasting can be shared for wireless broadband as well, and is being used now in Africa, in Colombia, soon in Brazil, and should be promoted either a dynamic spectrum sharing or a rules-based spectrum sharing. But we cannot afford to stop benefiting from a more democratic use of spectrum, which has not proven a good way to make it scarce and expensive, leaving out 3.5 billion people that currently have no access to internet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriana. My dear Latin American friends took very, very loose time. So we have less time for questions, but let's see how we manage. So there is one question from Karin on the chat, but I guess that's kind of like a separate, not necessarily around her intervention. So I will invite all the participants in the room to put their questions in the chat or raise their hand so that they can ask some questions. I'm going to count from 6 to 1. And if you don't ask questions, I have a set of questions prepared for these occasions. So 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So a question for Carlos. Why do we need to think of capacity building as a fundamental axis for meaningful connectivity in the creation of our own infrastructure deployment projects?
Well, I think this question is very similar of that one Mark Carvel puts here, that why it is important to, sorry, let me turn on my camera. What is important to develop this training program, and how do we need to make it possible? And as I said, it's important to generate diverse programs and strategies that let the people develop their programs in their own specific way to do it. So if you have this opportunity, this type of training programs, you can also make programs to improve the applied research and the innovation in the community that is very different than the innovation to pursue commercial goals. So we need to rethink everything to make the paradigms of our minds, that what is the way to learn about technologies, what is the people work in this management and innovate and make it possible, this technology. So I know that it depends a lot of linkage or with the universities and other actors that maybe it is important to share their talks and the results with the communities themselves. So the first and the main thing that I think is to break paradigms about how can manage and how can innovate and that is important to develop this training.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you very much also for picking up the question from Mark from the scrolling the chat above. I totally lost it, changing screens. Thank you very much for that. So there is a question on the chat for Adriana from Genaro Cruz. Adriana, the question is, you mentioned the need to reform the USF frameworks. Do you think that internet companies should also contribute to these funds, as they are now the main commercial beneficiaries from connectivity? Please answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Genaro, for the question. I think it's absolutely valid to bring the intense users of internet connectivity contribute to the expansion and upgrading of the networks, mainly OTTs, providers of content. But that's not enough. New assurances from governments that they will invest in that money efficiently, transparently, and to different stakeholders. Even if we have large sums of money from these OTTs or internet providers, if that money keeps going to large operators and then 5 years later abandon the services, that is not sustainable. We have proposed, in the case of Brazil, for instance, allocating these resources also to community networks, to women-led initiatives. There are a lot of women-led community networks, to indigenous people to develop their own content in their own languages, and of course, also for infrastructure. So yes, let's put these new stakeholders to contribute, but also let's rethink USF with new beneficiaries of the funds that can be sustainable for their community's welfare. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. That is a fantastic way to wrap up this first block. I don't see other questions for Sonia, but we will have an additional set of Q&A minutes at the end. So if you have other questions there, please share them there. So now I would like to thank Sonia, Carlos, and Adriana for sharing your views with the audience. And as mentioned by Sonia on her opinion remarks, this process of reflection to gain a deeper understanding around what access alone can do for individuals and communities continues to mature as access to the internet is looked at the intersection of a multiple number of issues. Even though for some of us old-timers here, it seems that we are discussing the same things again, I guess we are always rediscovering in making progress in that regard. So on this part of the session, we have two speakers lined up to talk about two different dimensions of accessibility. First, we have Edmund Chang, founder and CEO of .Asia organization. He will be talking about domain names as a navigation tool to access, to relate to content in your own language, and the future technical developments in this space. And then he will be followed by my dear Chennai Chair, a special advisor on Africa Innovation Miradi from the Mozilla Foundation, to talk about Common Voice, an open source initiative to provide language data sets that can be used to build technologies in local languages. She will highlight some of Mozilla's work in this space on underserved languages. So with that, I will welcome Edmond to the panel.
Thank you,
And
Sylvia.
you have 7 minutes, Edmond, so I will be waving.
Please, I will try. Thank you for having me, and especially on this really meaningful topic for me in terms of meaningful access. And to me, really engaging in the internet governance community has always been this particular topic that I am going to talk about, and I still feel very passionate about. And Sylvia, you just mentioned that seems like we always keep coming back to the same issue. And I think this issue of digital divide and meaningful access will always be around. The reality is that we will never completely solve it. There is always going to be a new generation coming in. There's always going to be a marginalized community, and I think this is part of the reason why it seems like that is so. And also in what I'm going to talk a little bit more about is that because of certain market failures, I believe this is an issue both in terms of the digital divide and in terms of meaningful access. And what I'm going to talk about is the internet navigation system, which is the domain names and email addresses. There are situations of market failures which causes issues that just prolong itself. And I think digital divide itself manifests in very different forms as well. So when you go back to the issue of domain names, and of course I'm talking about the main topic is about internationalized domain names and email addresses. So domain names and identifiers in your own local language. Some people say that there is search, you don't really need domain names anymore. But the reality and the fact of the internet infrastructure today still is that domain names remain the most reliable direct navigation method on the internet. And local businesses, local brands use their own local native language to express themselves online. And this is the reason why local domain names are important. And when you think about it in another aspect, local issues and local perspectives are often expressed in local languages. And just having a concern group or an activist group online and trying to set up a website or trying to set up a group online, that most likely the identity or the issue at hand would be expressed in local languages. And therefore, this linkage between local content and the language you can use to name identifiers on the internet comes hand in hand. And technically, the interesting thing is that the internet has been able to present content in local languages quite readily, and it's not a general issue. But this issue of domain names and email addresses, at least for what I've been working on, maybe it's me that is a failure, not the market. But the last 20 years, we have been working on this issue for the development and utilization of email addresses and domain names in local native languages. And that really represents more than half of the history of domain names itself, which came into being in the last last millennial, if you will, but the 80s and the last century. But now we're, 20 year, in the 2020s, and we are still having this issue. And the reason, I think, is because of a kind of market failure. The infrastructure providers, a lot of the infrastructure providers on the internet, they are more accustomed to setting up the network and developing the network in the English language, and the protocols and the domain name and email addresses system, they kind of take for granted that it has to be in English. And what that means is that it creates a what I call a market failure, because the supplying system and the platforms themselves do not support the utilization of email addresses and domain names in local languages, and therefore the latent demand, the actual demand from the end user, cannot be realized or is not visible. This creates a chicken and egg issue. Is the ISP, is the hosting provider supposed to upgrade the system first, or and they keep kind of complaining that, hey, nobody is buying these domain names, nobody's asking for it. But the way that I see it after quite some time now is realizing that this is much more akin to a social movement rather than just a technical upgrade, because technical upgrade allows you to either mitigate risk or to gain more business. This situation is neither, because you can't see the customer wanting it, and you can't see and the problem is there is not a perceived technical risk for not doing anything. Rather, adding a new component increase technical risk, and therein lies the need for market intervention. Because whenever you have a market failure, I believe the idea is you need market intervention, and this is an issue that is not just for the local communities, just the Chinese community or the Vietnamese community upgrading the system is not enough. We need the global internet community to actually upgrade the systems for the overall network to work, the interoperability, and the ability for different platforms to utilize these identifiers is important. An example is that just because you're a platform in the US or the UK, let's say a social network like Facebook or Twitter, a local user in Vietnam can probably use Vietnamese to interact and interface with everything in Vietnamese, because these platforms have localized their content. However, the question is whether in their profile they can use an email address in their local language, or they can put in their profile a internationalized domain name. And that is one of the main issues, is that even for platforms that are catered to the English community, for example, it requires that platform to be upgraded to allow for these protocol updates in order for the entire internet to be supporting localized email addresses and domain names. And or else it becomes these names, if they can be used, let's say a local community already completely supports domain names in their own language, it's still on the overall global internet becomes like a second-class citizen, and that is a problem, because these names, if they cannot be used universally across different platforms, they become a second-class citizen, and therein lies the market failure. Many of the registries and registrars in the industry has started to support these new internationalized domain names. However, the hosting providers and many of the other platforms are still coming to warming up to this idea. So I think this is the issue that really requires different players and different policies to address. And sometimes people say, today we have search, we have apps, nobody uses domain names anymore. But I really want to, highlight that people search in their own languages, and domain names need to be there in their own language, not, just as a simple example for search engine optimization, but also direct navigation, also for network development and maintenance. And if you talk about mobile apps, I would dare say that every useful mobile app behind it depends on domain names. Every mobile app that you use today that's on your phone depend on domain names behind it. And for them to, for those engineers to be able to use all the languages in their own language to manage the network and manage the app, we need internationalized domain names to work properly. And finally, I'll leave with this. As we go into a world with voice input as a thing, you can say that today, maybe local users can use those English alphabetic and numeric names as domain names quite readily. But it would be really strange for, let's say, Korean in Korea to start speaking to their phone in English when they, usually would be speaking their phone in their own language. A Vietnamese person in Vietnam would be speaking to their phone in their own language, and to navigate the internet with suddenly switch to English would be very, very strange. So this is an issue, again, I think that is being addressed by the internet community, but we need a broader community to look at. The UASG, the Universal Acceptance Steering Group, you can check out uasg.tech, is a group that is looking at this, but we need the governments around the world, like IT procurement processes. When you procure your systems for the next time, put in requirements that the database, the system would support internationalized domain names and email addresses. This is about not just about technical upgrade. I think it is about meaningful access in supporting local content and expression of localized internet identity, because ultimately domain names and email addresses really reflect people's offline identity online. And today, that is not fully possible yet. And this is what the IDNs, what we call internationalized domain names and email addresses, is about. And hopefully this is, I didn't cross too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. Thank you very much for your intervention. I was one of the IDN working group members back when I was pregnant. My son is almost 18. So it seems that a whole life has passed, literally. So, and we continue to discover. So I really enjoyed this topic very much. Chennai, I hope you are ready. I can't see you on the list. I'm not sure. So I hope we can move to Chennai, Chair, for her intervention on local languages. And I can see some questions on the chat that will be picked up in the next block of Q&A. So Chennai, are you there?
Yes, I am, Sylvia.
Yeah, go ahead. Please go ahead, Chennai.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and good afternoon or good day, good morning to everyone on the call. Thank you so much, Edmund, for setting the scene around the localization that's needed, especially for languages, and really setting out that point on the ability to speak to your device and your device understanding you and the challenges of switching. So this is the kind of work that we are doing at Mozilla Foundation. So from our perspective, the problem is that over the next decade, speech is going to become a primary way people interact with devices, from laptops to phones to digital assistants. Today's voice-enabled devices are actually inaccessible to much of humanity because they cannot understand the vast swaths of the world's languages, accents, speech, and patterns. So currently, neither the big systems, neither Amazon Alexa, Apple Siri, or Google Home, who are the main players in the voice market, support a single native African languages. So I'm highlighting in that particular context of, from that perspective, none of the systems work. And they also tend to work better for men than they do for women. And people often struggle to understand when it comes to different accents. And this actually raises an issue around bias for the data sets that are trained. And it's also quite exclusionary because it means that one has to switch the way they speak or has to find someone who the system understands or can't use the voice service when it's actually part of their point of accessibility to be able to engage their devices. So then on top of that, we're not saying that the data isn't there on these vast swaths of languages because people speak into their devices, but it's actually that speech recognition data is siloed. So you find that only a handful of companies handle the majority of speech recognition interactions, and they often do so using their own proprietary data, which stifles innovation in the broader ecosystem. So we've got this issue of we need to be able to access this service that actually helps people to better interact with their devices through voice, but the system is siloed and there's bias that exists. So through Common Voice, this was launched in 2017, we're actually trying to aim to level the playing field while mitigating AI bias. It's an ambitious open source initiative with the purpose of democratizing and diversifying voice technology. Common Voice actually enables people to donate their voices, to contribute their voices to a free and publicly available database that startups, researchers, and developers can use to train voice-enabled apps, products, and services. So if you were to type commonvoice.mozilla.org right now, you would get onto our landing page and see which languages we have available and participate in the process. To date, it actually represents the world's largest multilingual public domain voice dataset with more than 9,000 hours of voice data and 65 different languages represented. So the purpose of that is actually trying to build that missing data set or data corpus of languages that are vastly available from people and is actually really being driven by the community, because it's only possible when people in a particular community gather around to have their language represented on the platform to enable the buildup of services on top of the language data sets and the models created. So looking specifically at the issue that I already raised around African languages, what we have done is that we've partnered with the German Institute, GIZ, Bill and Melinda Gates, and FCDO. So our first trial run of actually trying to see what a voice-specific intervention would look like was us focusing on Rwanda, the language Kinyarwanda spoken there, and then Luganda. So this was done in 2020, and the purpose was actually to see what would be the impact of having a speech recognition system or text-to-speech or speech-to-text that then can actually be used as an intervention, in particular for the pandemic. So with Rwanda, we launched the first voice-based chatbot that recognizes an African language in Kinyarwanda, French, and English, which allow people to get access to information for COVID-19. So this for us is one of those interventions where clearly being able to have universal access also enables one to have, to observe their right of access to information. And you want to have access to information in a language that you understand. And so beyond that, seeing how that from our side was successful, we went on to start building up the language corpus for Kiswahili, which is spoken in over 6 African countries, specifically in East Africa. And in this one, we partnered with Gates and FCDO and GIZ again to actually really figure out how can we have a voice system that can be used in response to low connectivity contexts, low digital literacy context by then having a system as a voice platform or integrated into the already existent, say, platforms such as WhatsApp that would allow for people to get information specific to agriculture and finance. And we've built this knowing that we want to have an impact, particularly for marginalized groups along the lines of gender, where we know affordability and digital literacy is the highest issue, especially for women and young people. And then also thinking about it for people who are based in rural areas that often face the challenge of actually having services built for them because the business model is not as exciting, or even just having interventions that address their needs in those particular spaces, because they are the ones who mainly occupy, for example, sustainable agriculture or are financially excluded. So to sum up, my point actually to sum up is that at the end of the day, our key goal is to really take in a language intervention that allows for their platforms to have open data sets in people's languages, where we want to explore whether it's possible to develop voice recognition for the language of underserved communities as a platform. And having this with this data being available as a digital public good in the open source domain, for us, it's something that could allow for local innovation in emerging markets to develop products and services for serving marginalized communities. And so that for us is one of the key things, that by taking on an open source project, we want to support innovation specifically for local languages to make sure that the web actually works for everyone and they're able to access information. And that's my intervention. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Chennai. As always, clear as water flowing through our brains. Thank you so much for your intervention. We had designed the session to allow for engagement between the audience, and I see a few questions on the chat. So the idea of this last few minutes for Q&A will be to try to connect the two big chunks of topics, let's say, that we have discussed under this issue that we will be looking during the upcoming IGF that starts today. So the idea will be to try and ask the speakers to help us connect those dots. So personally, I saw lots of connections between the things that Edmond said and a lot of the comments that Carlos mentioned around how training is so important to be able to update the network, to have those services coming up in a language that speaks to you, that it reflects your culture and reflects your needs. I'm sure other people saw other connections. So your questions and your comments on the chat are super important. So I'm going to pick up on the question from Carlos to Edmond around what experiences and organizations do you locate in Asia that work on these materials in other languages that allow to understand the technical issues of the internet? And you can mention us.
Absolutely. I mean, UPNIC is the grand source for technical information in different languages, especially in Asia. I think that's actually a good question. As on the topic that I talked about, which is internationalized domain names and email addresses. I do note that the UASG, as I mentioned, has been working very hard to put their documents in different languages, but it is a challenge. Even as recent as when we talk about DNS abuse and some of the cybersecurity measures, there are so many languages in Asia, and I always understand the challenges there is that once you produce one set of materials, and a lot of it is for better or worse starts with English, and then you try to work it out in different languages, and you start with the bigger languages, then you go down to the smaller, and that's the whether you in some ways, whether you like it or not, it's the nature of things. However, I think what what Chennai just said is very relevant in those cases. Even in these type of materials, the more open you put it and actually engage volunteers, that might actually be a better approach to doing things. And I absolutely have been supporting that approach by the UASG. In fact, my organization has helped the UASG, for example, to do some of that. And so in terms of where to find them, I think obviously APNIC is an area. I think different ISOC chapters help do that. But in terms of the process for getting that done, I think more and more, I hope the materials are in Creative Commons or in a more open platform, such that that could engage volunteers to locally to actually help put it in place. Because even if we do translations, not just about the resource and so on, but how well it translates into the local language. And you really require the local language people, the technical people from that area to actually chip in and help out for it to be meaningful.
Thank you, Edmund. I think that those comments are super important because they connect with something that Sonia mentioned at the beginning around how important it was that the fact that we don't have a definition of what capacity building or digital skills actually are. So, I will very unapologetically self-promote what the APNIC does, which is really advanced, intermediate and advanced, very technical knowledge sharing around internet infrastructure and numbers and routing management and security. That's one. But there are a number of other organizations that are working on digital skills for different kinds of audiences, also thinking of youth, thinking of children, thinking of the device that you use, not only the language. So it is really amazing. I don't know if Sonia is around to bring us a little bit back to that comment that she made at the beginning about why do we need some sort of a framework or understanding of what digital skills are to try to figure out what is missing and where people are, what mapping exercises are out there. Are you around, Sonia?
I am. Thank you, Sylvia, for asking. I mean, I think what Shania was sharing and Edmund as well, but I have to say, I mean, I really appreciate the way Shania was presenting those, challenges and how to really address them. And they're very important. I was just putting on the chat and I was adding more. I mean, these are the kinds of questions that we have to solve, to resolve, right? To have this concept of meaningful access actually be meaningful for everyone. Because otherwise, if we cannot include these concepts and the idea of language content, the different languages and everything that is required to make those languages work in a way that is seamless for everyone, then we are by default also being part of the exclusion process, right? We are, embracing exclusion by allowing a concept, a definition to be able to do that. And we can't afford to do that. We don't want that. It's completely counterproductive. So what I would say, Sylvia, is that it continues to be a challenge. But what is very encouraging to hear from Edmund and Shania is that some of the examples and the work that they're doing shows that if we care, if we pay attention to it, we can actually take action to change that picture. And we need to start prioritizing those. We cannot simply prioritize or focus on those pieces of that kind of meaningful access circle that either it's easier or because it's infrastructure, let's focus on that without considering the other. So what I would say here is that I call on all of us to challenge each other to make sure that we don't leave those issues outside of the boundaries of meaningful access. And in fact, if we don't address them, we need to accept the criticism that we are just as others being part of this exclusionary process of not allowing people to be part of, this possibility that we here, most of us on this call are actually quite privileged to have. And so I would say lots of challenges for us to address. And I hope that I actually want to learn from all of you, not just today, but continuously, in the next months, how we can change that, picture. How can we, bring clarity to those definitions and concepts in December and beyond through the IGF process, so that we can, as a group, as a multi-stakeholder collective, really carry on the idea of meaningful access in a way that includes all of these definitions, includes all these concepts, includes all these elements that will eventually, we hope, move away any sort of exclusionary attempt, and it turns it around, and it's about bringing more people to the possibilities. So I hope that answers your question, Sylvia, but I look forward to learning from most of it.
Thank you, Sonia. That is a really good reflections to connect with the first block of this session. There is one question and comment in the chat about connecting to what kind of internet, the good internet or the bad internet. Amir was asking. So I would like to ask all the panelists for literally like a 30 seconds response to what do you guys think about this? What is that we are asking people to make the effort to connect? I've been working on this issue around getting people connected to the internet for more than half of my life, and I was chatting with a colleague the other day saying that I really don't want to spend the other next 25 years of my life before I retire to save people from these mini monsters. So what are your takes on that? And I will start with Adriana and then follow with Carlos, and we'll get from there. Go, Adriana. 30 seconds, please.
I think Adriana froze and we lost her, Sylvia, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah.
Maybe then go to Carlos and let's see if she comes back.
It looks like she's just coming back.
Are you around, Adriana? Can you hear us? Let's try Carlos. There you go. Go. It's okay.
I could not hear the question because I had a bad connection.
The question is on the chat, and it's about meaningful connectivity and access to what internet? The good internet or the bad internet? And what are your take on that? And you have 30 seconds, not 30 Mexican seconds, 30 seconds.
Mexican or Vietnamese either. Yes, if the internet is not responsive to communities' needs, people will choose to disconnect or to not connect. If the threats and requirements are exclusive, if the threats for women are exclusive or for minorities, then we will have people voluntarily deciding to switch off. And that will pose a global problem of not having access to anything, communication services, transactions, and that. So we really need to bring in bottom-up solutions and understand that there's no one size fits all.
Thank you, Adriana. Carlos, your 30 seconds.
Yes, I think three things is the more important thing. Local content, how people can use the network for sharing their local content and the things that have important to them. Second, the training in a way that people can be empowered in the different level of they want to involve with the telecommunication services in their communities. And three, diversity in the language, diversity in the way to understand telecommunications, to understand training, and to understand everything here.
Thank you, Carlos. Now, Sonia, 30 seconds.
So, sorry, I missed actually your question. I apologize, but two things here. I think it's it's important, as I mentioned earlier, for us to come to a common understanding and work towards a common objective. I think one of the amazing benefits of IGF and the collective that it is, as I mentioned earlier, is that we bring all these different visions, these different ideas, and I think there's really great opportunity for us to achieve a better common understanding, including better definitions of these terms. And if we all embrace then those commonly defined definitions, including what meaningful access is, we can all work towards that same goal. You know, in all the different things that we work, but we can work towards that same goal. And to me, that's really important. In terms of the sessions at the IGF, Sylvia, there's so many that I think are so important across all of these different themes that we have. What I want to say, instead of being, having a preference to one or another, I want to say, I want to hear from the sessions as much as possible concrete examples that will help us then bring clarity to these definitions. As I mentioned in my presentation earlier, I think there's still a lot of ambiguity. And so I want what I learn, I want to hear things from everyone that will help us clarify all of these concepts. Otherwise, if we continue to work with a lot of ambiguity, it will be really hard for us collectively also to make the case. And I think we cannot afford that any longer.
Thank you, Sonia. That is, again, a call for action and a very important one. So I will then 30 seconds for Chennai, and then we close with Edmund.
Thanks, Sylvia. So our response to the point around what kind of internet are we trying to get people to access to? And so my 30 seconds is really, we're trying to develop something that allows people to have a choice to get connected to the internet that's going to be relevant to them, that fulfills the purpose and need that they have, and also allows for them to actually just enjoy having access to this resource. And that's the particular thing that we're fighting for. And at the end of the day, whilst we're trying to work towards universal access, it's also to be able to hold those with power and resources accountable to ensure safety, and also to ensure that everyone has that choice to be able to stay on the platform and not leave because of the experiences that we know are existent on the internet that then are biased or discriminate people when they do come to the internet.
Thank you very much, Chennai. Edmund, over to you.
Thank you, Sophia. The question of good internet or bad internet, I think is really rather interesting, because it boils down to, first of all, we got to probably take the good with the bad in many cases. But the question is, good for who and bad for who? Is it good for the government and bad for the citizens? That's probably not what we want. Is it good for the criminals and bad for the corporations? And of course, that's not what we want. I guess what we want is good for the citizens and bad for the criminals, right? I mean, that's really what it is. And we have to, in some ways, keep the network open, and therein lies a little, sometimes a little bit bad would come in. But overall, I think when we've been talking about universal access and universal acceptance for many years now, 20 years, and for very beginning, it keeps saying that we've got to solve this immediately. But the reality is that we probably need to take a longer term view, and we need to address some of the fundamental policies, and including education. And that's probably where we will need to put our efforts in as well.
Thank you so much, Edmund. I think I am not going to even attempt to summarize and make a concluding remarks about how all of these dots connect. I am actually going to listen to the session again. I put the link on the YouTube channel that you can see the recording later and have a look at the transcript to write some notes to help the IGF Secretariat with the messages from this session. And I encourage all the speakers to send us the key points of their intervention, so that the key messages of the IGF start taking shape, as Wim was calling us earlier. I know noticed Henriette made a comment on the chat, and I am going to apologize to the chair of the IGF for not reading it, but I'm sure everyone else saw it. And I want to thank you all for those of you that woke up really early in the morning, of those of us that are very late at night doing this, to come in together and participate in this session and try to find common understandings and figure out ways of moving ahead in this space. So with that, I will thank you very much for your time. Thanks to the Secretariat for all the support. Apologies for the technical issues and the bad humor on my part. And thank you very much for all the participation. I think there is another session after this. There is a few minutes in between, and I will give the mic to Eleonora so that the 75 people that are still there don't drop out of the session, and we keep the momentum going. So over to you, Eleonora, and thank you very much for allowing me to moderate today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you all for a great session. There is a half-hour break now, and we will continue with our program with a segment on economic and social inclusion and human rights that again begins in a half hour at 14:30 UTC.
Thank you, Eleonora. Thanks, everyone. See you in 30 minutes then. Bye.